Good morning and welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress and I'll be your host for the next hour. And thanks for tuning in. And we'll continue our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power. Remember yesterday, by the end of the broadcast, we were talking about a period of time when the Roman Catholic hierarchy in America were, as observed by the Jesuits in Europe and the Jesuits in this country, were well indoctrinated in their responsibility to obey the Pope. Now, this was at a time when Europe was in rebellion against the papacy, and strangely enough, this Protestant country, the United States of America, within it was a Roman Catholic church, a Roman Catholic hierarchy, and the Roman Catholic people who had been impressed for a long time with the authority of the papacy and how our form of government was contrary to that form of government most enjoyed by the papacy, and that it was a matter of a salvific issue that Roman Catholics in this country obey the Pope, and even if that means to grow more and more dissatisfied with our form of government. And at this particular time, when the United States was prepared for it, there was a book written, a very timely book written in Spain by a Roman Catholic priest, which was eventually translated from Spanish and into English and propagated in this country to American Roman Catholics. And it touted the power of the Pope, or the Pope himself, as the best guide of men in the path of liberty and progress. And it inculcated in the minds of Roman Catholics that how much they had to owe their religion for the affluence that they enjoy in the world, and to remind Protestants that their form of religion was based on error. Okay, this work was so highly commended, as it says, in a work so highly commended as this is to American readers, one would scarcely expect to find a labored effort to prove that the oath of allegiance to our government taken by a Roman Catholic amounts to nothing and has no binding obligation when the welfare of the Roman Catholic Church requires it to be disregarded. Okay, if you're following along page 576, I apologize to my listeners for not giving you a heads up what page we're in. The first full paragraph on page 576. Speaking of this book that was published in Spain by this Spanish Roman Catholic priest and promulgated in this country, widely distributed in English in this country, it says, in a work so highly commended as this is to American readers, one would scarcely expect to find a labored effort to prove that the oath of allegiance to our government taken by a Roman Catholic amounts to nothing and has no binding obligation when the welfare of the Roman Catholic Church requires it to be disregarded. But those who prepared it for publication here understood perfectly well the character of the persons into whose hands it would mostly fall, Roman Catholics, right? And that their minds were easily impressed by anything, however extravagant or preposterous, put forth authoritatively in behalf of their church. Remember, the Roman Catholics in this country, contrary to the Roman Catholics in Europe, were very anxious and eager to receive anything from the Pope's hand. They had been taught to obey the Pope and to listen to the Pope as the father of their church, as the vicar of Christ, the replacement of the Son of God on earth. They were not in a spirit of rebellion in this country as they were in Europe. So the United States of America, the Roman Catholic Church in America, became a mission field for the papacy to propagate, or to restore, rather, his old world order. It was the best hope in the world that if the old world order under which the Pope ruled supreme was ever going to gain the ascendancy again in the world, it had to be through the American Roman Catholic Church. It says, and they did not miscalculate, as we may infer from the fact that in the United States, the dogma of infallibility has been accepted with greater unanimity and more readily than in any other country in the world. A fact which renders an exposition of the teachings of this book and others like it not only interesting and instructive, but of more than ordinary importance as well as significance. So you can see the Pope is availing himself of the greatest opportunity in the world to reestablish himself as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and that is through the American Roman Catholic Church. As unlikely as that might seem, that was the goal of the papacy. And it says this author has a chapter upon resistance to the civil power, in which, after the necessary preliminary discussion, he begs his readers to bear in mind the general principles at all times inculcated by Catholicity, viz., the obligation of obeying legitimate authority. Okay, the word legitimate is italicized here. So we're automatically bringing into question what authorities are legitimate. And it says, in order to make the desired application of this principle and to explain what he means by legitimate authority, he puts and answers a most pertinent question as follows, quote, in the first place, are we to obey the civil power when it commands something that is evil in itself? No, we are not, for the simple reason that what is evil in itself is forbidden by God. Now we must obey God rather than man, unquote. He does not stop here to explain what it is and what is not evil, what is and what is not evil, but he proceeds as follows, quote, in the second place, are we to obey the civil power when it interferes in matters not included in the circle of its faculties or its influence? No, for with regard to these matters, it is not a power. Now, obviously, my readers should realize that this is an inference that the civil power of the United States has no power at all over the Roman Catholic Church, and that the civil power of the United States must be disobeyed when it extends its reach beyond the legitimate reach of the civil power according to the papacy's determination. So they're inciting a rebellion against the civil government. Subtle as it is, that's what they're doing. Now, in order that there may be no misapprehension of his meaning, he then points out the distinction between the temporal and the spiritual power, and insists upon the independence of the latter with respect to the former. In other words, the spiritual power, that is, which is vested in the Pope, should in no way be affected by the civil power. In other words, the church is autonomous. Hands off. The government should have no say whatsoever, and none of its laws should interfere with the free and full operation of the church, the Roman Catholic Church. Now, in his view, the church must be left by the state perfectly free to act for itself in all matters within the spiritual jurisdiction. It must in no sense be subject to the laws of the state, that is, the church. In no sense, the Roman Catholic Church, in no sense, should be subject to the laws of the state, because that would impair the freedom of the Roman Catholic Church or the Pope. And whenever the state undertakes to subject the church to its laws, it passes beyond, quote, the circle of its faculties. unquote. In other words, it's gone out of its lawful jurisdiction. Anytime the civil power passes a law that adversely affects the Roman Catholic Church, it has gone beyond its rightful bounds. Now, he then continues, quote, ever since the foundation of the Church, and by that he means the Roman Catholic Church, this principle of the independence of the civil power has at all times served, by the mere fact of its existence, to remind men that the rights of the civil power are limited, that there are things beyond its province, cases in which a man may say, and ought to say, I will not obey, unquote. Satisfied with his argument to maintain and enforce these propositions, and it undoubtedly displays great ingenuity and ability, he reverts to his original question and repeats what he had already said, but in more expressive terms this time. He says this, quote, it remains then established that we are to be subject to the civil power so long as it does not go beyond its proper limits. But the Catholic doctrine never enjoins obedience when the civil power oversteps the limits of its faculties, unquote. He adopts the general and commonly accepted definition of unjust laws, such as are against the common welfare, public policy, etc., in regard to which nobody would enter into controversy with him. But he goes beyond this and finds other laws equally unjust because of their opposition to the divine law. He says, quote, laws may also be unjust in another point of view, when they are contrary to the will of God, as the laws of tyrants enforcing idolatry, or anything else contrary to the divine law. Now, before I even continue, let me ask my listeners, who is the tyrant in this world? Demonstrably, in this book, the tyrant of this world is the papacy. It overthrows governments. It instigates wars between nations at peace. It instigates rebellion of people against their lawful governments. It releases people from their oaths of allegiance to their government whenever the papacy declares their government to be de facto. Who is the tyrant? Who is the one that reduced humanity to an abject slave? It's the papacy. And what does this tyrant on the earth do? He enforces idolatry. He forces the world on their knees to worship him as a god. And there are also images and idols within the church. As a matter of canon law, they are to kneel, bow down, and worship images of saints and of the Virgin Mary and of Jesus and of angels and every other thing. This is the pot calling the kettle black, to put it in the meekest terms. Okay? What are unjust laws? They are laws that are contrary to the will of God, as the laws of tyrants enforcing idolatry or anything else contrary to the divine law. Let me tell you something. Roman Catholic canon law is the antithesis to God's law. Roman Catholicism is the antithesis to the body of Christ. And here we have Roman Catholics standing on their soapboxes lecturing the world about unlawful laws. Yet this is received by the people as credible discussions, credible assertions by the Roman Catholic Church, when they are laughable on their face. This demonstrates the absurdity of the Roman Catholic Church, the hypocrisy of the Roman Catholic Church, and the blind ignorance of the people of the world to accept such ridiculous, contradictory, hypocritical, and downright Antichrist speech. And it says, with respect to such laws, it is not allowable under any circumstances to obey them. For, as it is said in the Acts of the Apostles, we must obey God rather than man. And you know what? Not a Christian on this earth would argue with that. We ought to obey God rather than man. The question is, who is the God of this world? Is it Satan through his Antichrist, the Pope? Or is it Christ himself sitting on his throne at the right hand of his Father making intercession for us, who gave us a law to live by? That's the question, and that's the question that the papacy always tries to confuse. Is Christ the ruler of his kingdom? Does he reign from on high, or does he have to have a human vicar on earth who can arrogate to himself the attributes of God in infallibility and such like? It's simply that easy to answer. Is Christ capable of ruling his kingdom without an earthly vicar in Rome? The answer is yes. And that ought to speak volumes to Catholics and Protestants alike in this country, especially since post-Vatican Council II. Now, having thus established his premises, he lays down as the logical result of the doctrines maintained by the Roman Catholic Church these rules. Number one, we cannot, under any circumstances, obey the civil power when its commands are opposed to the divine law. When laws are unjust, they are not binding in conscience. That's number two. Number three, it may become necessary to obey these laws for the motives of prudence, that is, in order to avoid scandal and commotions. Okay, number one, we cannot under any circumstances obey the civil power when its commands are opposed to divine law. Number two, when the laws are unjust, they are not binding in conscience. And number three, it may be necessary to obey these laws from motives of prudence, that is, in order to avoid scandal and commotion. Let me point out to my listeners something that may not be automatically apparent to you. Point number three, it may become necessary to obey these laws from motives of prudence, that is, in order to avoid scandal and commotions. I want to ask the question to my listeners, how long do you think the Pope is going to allow Roman Catholics in this country to obey unjust laws that run contrary to the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church, on just for the mere sake of prudence? And you can interpret the word prudence to mean self-preservation. How long do you think the Pope is going to allow Roman Catholics in this country to preserve themselves by obeying unjust laws? I'll answer that question for you. Only until the Roman Catholic Church grows to the power necessary to overthrow those unjust laws. Now let me tell you what the unjust laws are. The entire Constitution and Bill of Rights of this country. Point number three indicates that there will come a time in this country, the goal of the papacy, the goal of the American Roman Catholic Church and every true Roman Catholic in this country, the goal is to overthrow this unlawful Constitution and Bill of Rights and our form of government, and to replace it with a papal king, just as they enjoyed during the Dark Ages. Okay. I hope that's clear to my listeners. If people are persistent in thinking that this day is never going to come, I propose to you that the day has already come, and that the New World Order is that date that has arrived when the Roman Catholic Church considers it no longer prudent to tolerate these unjust laws. and that they've grown in power and influence and strength, especially since Vatican Council II, when it is possible, with a reasonable hope of success, to overthrow our form of government. And we're seeing it right before our very eyes. It's been ongoing at least for 20 years since NAFTA and GATT. And all the other economic, religious, political, racial, social, and every other controversy in this country has been exacerbated. Why? To foster this change of government. It's going to become apparent to everyone that there is a dramatic change needed in the United States of America. This has all been brought about and orchestrated by the Roman Catholic Church and all of the organizations ultimately serving the Roman Catholic Church. We'll talk about that on another broadcast. But we are arriving at the very day that R.W. Thompson is prophesying in this book. This day has come upon us, and we're seeing the effects of that swift change, that swift takeover of this Protestant constitutional republic in replacement, to be replaced by a papal king. Now, you say, well, the president's not a king, he's elected by the people. No, he's not. It appears that he is. But if you consider the fact that the candidates for President of the United States are picked by the Council on Foreign Relations, they've already been vetted by the Papacy. Every one of the candidates for president are in agreement with the Pope's New World Order, or they wouldn't be candidates. And you simply must comprehend that if the Roman Catholic Church has picked all the candidates for the presidency, you can vote for whomever you please. The Pope doesn't care. He's already got his man. That's how far it's come, and it's worse than that. It even goes down to state and local governments. They're ready to overthrow our form of government, and they're going to do it in the name of Christianity. And Christians are going to go along with it, when in fact it is designed for their very destruction, to revert them back to the old world order. Two classes of people, the rich ruling elite, that is the priesthood, and those who serve the priesthood, and the people. Put down, desperately poor, denied the basic necessities of life, health care, food, water. They're going to be taxed to death, worked to death, and threatened to death if they don't go along with this new world order. And when the discussions that I hear on amateur radio and other outlets, when they talk about the new world order, religion is never a factor in those discussions. They simply do not comprehend. They think this is all about the nameless, faceless, rich ruling elite, but they don't have a clue who they are. You do, because you listen to Inquisition Update. But you can listen to these discussions till hell freezes over, and you'll never hear once mentioned the Roman Catholic Church. And it's ghastly that this could happen to this country outside of the recognition of the people of this country who's really bringing these changes about. Why is it so secret? Because it was no secret in England when Rome tried to do this, and they put down the Roman Catholic Church. The same could happen in this country if Americans ever figured out who's really behind this. Put a name and a face on the rich ruling elite. It's the same today as it was then. Now, the author, R.W. Thompson, continues in the book The Papacy and the Civil Power. He says, these are the principles upon which he is rejoiced to know that, quote, the admirable institution of European monarchy was founded, unquote. Principles which he thinks it the duty of the Roman Catholic Church to maintain throughout the world. Did you hear that? It is the duty of the Roman Catholic Church to reestablish and maintain the European model of monarchy. Okay, the Pope cannot rule the world if he doesn't have a king in each nation. And let me tell you something. The Pope has changed his tactics a bit, since it has already been determined that he could not control all the kings of Europe, because there's just too many rebellions, too much Protestant Reformation, too much rebellion against the Roman Catholic Church. He has to consolidate his power. He has to reduce the number of kings upon the earth so that it makes the kings easier to control. So the Club of Rome has reduced the world into 10 kingdoms. And you can just Google the Club of Rome, the 10 kingdoms of the Club of Rome, and you can see how the map of the world has been redrawn into 10 jurisdictions. 10 of them. And over which each jurisdiction will reign a papal king. So the Pope's only going to have 10 kings to control. And each of those kings will dominate in his jurisdiction. That's the New World Order. And it's a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Okay? So just do a little of your own homework and do some investigation on your own. The Club of Rome and the 10 nations. The 10 nations of the Club of Rome, or the 10 kingdoms of the Club of Rome. And see it for yourself. Now, these are the principles upon which he is rejoiced to know that the admirable institution of European monarchy was founded, principles which he thinks it the duty of the Roman Catholic Church to maintain throughout the world, because, as he says, they constitute, quote, the moral defenses by which that monarchy is surrounded, unquote. That is the papacy. He thinks the minds of men are already sufficiently wearied with foolish declamations against the tyranny of kings, and would bring back these salutary principles all such governments as have departed from them. Okay, he's teaching that the time of the rebellion against the kings is over. And the world is going to see it necessary to bring back those papal hierarchical kings. That we've played around long enough. The world has failed because it departed from the monarchies of the papacy. And it says these principles are the same substantially with those laid down by the Bishop England, and if applied in this country would, quote, test all our civil institutions by their conformity to the divine law. Remember, the divine law is interpreted by the Pope. Okay, we have established our government upon the theory that God recognizes the personality of each individual and will deal with him accordingly. Therefore, the conscience of every man is left free, that he may maintain whatsoever religious belief it shall approve. Necessarily, in order to establish and preserve this great principle, every individual and all church organizations are required to obey the laws of the state. The state recognizes that if the church has its way, conscience will be eliminated. Roman Catholicism will be shoved down your neck, or you'll be burned at the stake. That's the old world order. Built into our Constitution are protections against the old world order. That's why the Constitution has to be overthrown, according to the papacy. It says the spiritual power is not made independent of the temporal, but insofar as the authority to enact the necessary laws for the public good is concerned, the temporal power is made independent of the spiritual, the division between church and state. In all else, the spiritual power is left unimpaired. That is, it is left independent within its proper spiritual sphere. But according to the papal doctrine, as announced by this distinguished author, this places our government in the condition of having transcended the power or the proper limits of its faculties. In other words, it's gone too far of having violated the divine law and of requiring certain obligations of obedience from every citizen which cannot be yielded by those who obey the papacy without disobedience of the fundamental principles of their church organization. He insists that the government shall be arraigned at the bar of the papacy, where it shall be judged by the divine law, that the Pope alone, as God's vicegerent, is the only proper and infallible interpreter of the law, of that law, and that whatsoever principle of the government he shall declare to be unjust or heretical shall have no binding obligation upon the conscience of any Roman Catholic. Okay, there's your rebellion. There's the overthrow of the Constitution of the United States. And it's all based in this, that it is the Pope and the Pope alone who can interpret God's law. And you know what God's law is in Roman Catholic Church? We've been talking about it ever since the beginning of this book. The divine law, according to the Roman Catholic Church, is the false decretals, the pseudo-Isidorian decretals, that is, the decrees of all the popes. The popes have replaced God's law. They don't refer to God's law as God wrote it. When they talk about the divine law, they're talking about Roman Catholic canon law, the antithesis of God's law. And he says, already the present Pope has declared that in order that a government shall conform to the divine law, that is Roman Catholic canon law, the state and the church must be so united that the state shall obey the church. In other words, the state shall obey Roman Catholic canon law. That the ecclesiastical or hierarchical body must govern itself by its own laws. In other words, the priest, the pedophile priest, cannot be touched by the civil power. They can continue to molest little boys, do as they please, and only the church can touch those priests. And the world simply has to accept whatever justice the Pope renders to the pedophile priests. They're untouchable by the civil power. That's just one example. It encompasses every crime that a priest can commit. They're beyond the reach of the civil power because the church and the state are united. The church dictates to the state. The state must obey the church and never touch the church. Okay? That the ecclesiastical or hierarchical body must govern itself by its own laws and not be governed by or answerable to the laws of the state, even for crime. That there must be but one form of religion, and that the religion of Rome. That all other forms of religion except that of Rome, including the Protestantism of the United States, are heretical and ought to be annihilated. Remember the tenets of the Fourth Lateran Council? It was a duty placed upon Catholics on pain of excommunication or upon pain of being declared a heretic yourself if you didn't take positive steps to extirpate and annihilate and eliminate heretics. That's the divine law. Roman Catholic canon law says you must kill heretics. Okay? Only Romanism is the only religion acknowledged by the papacy. Protestantism is heretical. So is our Protestant form of government. It must be eliminated, extirpated, annihilated, and eliminated. That freedom of speech and freedom of the press and of conscience are all inconsistent with the divine right of kings to govern, and therefore should not be tolerated or allowed. You see any restrictions of the press? You see the press being controlled today? You suspect that it might be the papal hand behind it? Did you know that most of the mainstream media, mega media outlets in this country are owned by Knights of Malta, controlled by the Council on Foreign Relations, whose sole purpose is to eliminate all national sovereignties and to fit the world for the government of the Pope? The press is controlled because they're all on board with the Pope's New World Order. No freedom of speech, no freedom of press. Before long, they're going to go after people like me who open their mouths and expose all this. They've already attacked me on amateur radio. I can't hardly utter a peep on amateur radio without being drummed right off the frequency. That's going to translate into the alternative and eventually the mainstream medias. They're going to put down any voice of dissent. And they're going to call us domestic terrorists, hate speakers, whatever they can do to label us in inflammatory terms that will repulse the average uninformed American. And they will join the crusade against us. It's just a repeat of history. I'm not a prophet. Don't profess to be. All I have to do is look at history and see how the Vatican demonizes all opposition. It follows the same pattern throughout history. Demonization. Anybody opens his mouth to criticize or condemn or expose this Vatican Jesuit-led New World Order is persecuted beyond his ability to cope. And there's going to come a time when it isn't going to be possible to inform and alert the American people about the Vatican Jesuit-led New World Order. So while there's yet time, while my tongue is yet free to follow my conscience and to follow history and to follow the written Word of God, to expose and condemn and rebuke the papacy and its New World Order, I invite you all to listen every day and to call as many of your friends and family to listen as you possibly can, because there's going to come a time when no one will utter a peep against this New World Order, at least in terms that can be interpreted as the Pope's being behind it. Because he is going to be the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. They're going to put down all dissent. So if there's anybody in your family and circle of friends that's not familiar with the Vatican Jesuit-led New World Order, I'm telling you, there aren't many outlets left that have the courage, the spiritual fortitude to go against this monster, this beast that is overtaking the world. You think I'm being melodramatic? You want to see melodrama? You wait till every last voice is silenced, and there is no obstacle over which the papacy must jump, and they own this country lock, stock, and barrel. You want to see melodrama? You want to see blood running in the streets in this country? The blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus in this country, biblical proportion. It's going to happen right here in this country. It's going to happen right here in Protestant America. And that was the fear. That was the assessment of R.W. Thompson. The very purpose for writing this book was to warn the American people about what would happen if Roman Catholicism got control of the government. But we don't have to worry about it just being control of the United States government. They've got control of every government in the world, and those who have not yet succumbed are being warred against by the United States of America and her allies. The United States has been reduced to nothing but a papal proxy warrior, a crusading nation and a crusading alliance to make the rest of the world ready for papal rule. That's what our State Department's all about. That's what our CIA is all about. That's what our FBI is all about. That's what our president is all about. That's what Congress is all about. That's what the Supreme Court is all about. That's what your local government is all about. Your local municipal government, they're overseen by the local bishop. The New World Order is a done deal. It's already in the works. It's already working. And all that's left is the bloodshed. And it's about to commence. No more freedom of speech, no more freedom of press, no more freedom of conscience. they are all inconsistent with the divine right of kings to govern, and therefore should not be tolerated or allowed. That the present progress of the nations, which we attribute greatly to the influence of our example, must be arrested. It must be stopped, and the world turned back to the medieval ages. That he must be recognized as the only just and infallible expounder of the Word of God, that the Pope must be recognized as the only just and infallible expounder of the Word of God, and as incapable of error in all matters of faith and morals, that all mankind must obey him in faith and morals, because he stands upon the earth in the place of God Almighty, and that the Church, whose tremendous power is concentrated in his hands, may employ force whenever he shall deem it necessary to exact obedience as the means of reaching these results. All these things are openly and distinctly avowed in his encyclical and syllabus of error of 1864. He's talking specifically about Pope Pius IX, the reigning pope at the time of the writing of this book. I implore my listeners to read the syllabus of error of 1864 by Pope Pius IX to get a real good look at what is in store for the United States and the world. These things are distinctly avowed in the Pope Pius IX's encyclical and syllabus of error of 1864, are set forth in books, pamphlets, newspapers, the mainstream media, and tracts of immense circulation, and are foreshadowed by the persistent movements of the Roman Catholic hierarchy all over the world. And it requires but just an ordinary amount of intelligence to see that if the time should ever come when these principles shall obtain the ascendancy in the United States, like today perhaps, it must be necessarily at the expense of the fundamental and most cherished principles of our government. The very principles whose protection the Roman Catholic immigrants from Europe professedly desired to secure when they abandoned their citizenship among the effete monarchies of the Old World and hopefully acquired it in the New. But in order to demonstrate the legitimate use of the right of resistance to civil authority, this Jesuit author explains the Catholic doctrines in relation to de facto governments, that is, governments existing by what he calls a consummated fact, whether of revolution or otherwise, and in the actual possession of all necessary power. That these doctrines may be comprehended, it is necessary to keep in mind that according to the teachings of Rome, governments de facto are those which have been established by the people upon the overthrow of the kingly authority, which is considered the only legitimate authority. So how do the Jesuits view the government of the United States, seeing that it was born out of revolution? A de facto government. In other words, it's a government in fact, it exists, and it rules this country, but it's illegitimate. It's illegal because it doesn't accept the kingly hierarchy as set up by the papacy. It enjoys a government elected of, by, and for the people. It's a government in fact, but it's a government in rebellion against the papal standard. It's a government in rebellion against the papacy. So that's what a de facto government is. All right, the governments de jure are such as are based upon the law of God, with kings at their head, who shall obey the Pope as the highest authority upon the earth. So de facto governments are rebellious governments, illegal governments, governments that need to be replaced and will be replaced by the papal hierarchy. De jure governments are those which conform to the papal model. They are governed by kings. Now, is the United States governed by a king? Well, that's a darn good question these days. Because nowadays, the President of the United States can bypass Congress and just simply dictate, like a king, through presidential directives that already have the power of law when he signs them. There's no representation of the people. And who do you suppose those presidential directives really get their authority? Is it from the president? Or who? It comes from the Pope. All kingly power comes from the Pope. That's been the lesson of this entire book. Here we are on page 580. If there's one thing that we should have learned by now, is that the only government on the earth that the Pope recognizes are kingly governments. Now, the President of the United States, for all intents and purposes nowadays, is simply an administrator for the Pope. That's what the kings of Europe were, administrators for the Pope. The Pope ruled. And if a king didn't do or administer the nation the way the Pope told him to do, he simply absolved all the people of the nation of their oath of allegiance to the king, and they were commanded to kill him on pain of excommunication and eternal damnation. And that's the point we're getting to in the United States of America. The President of the United States rules from his kingly throne in Washington, D.C. by executive order. He's a papal executive. He's executing the laws of the papacy, Roman Catholic canon law in the country. And what did we get by that? Presidential Directive 51, NAFTA, GATT, the Patriot Act, and NDAA. Papal king, and every one of them take away freedom of speech, freedom of the press, takes away our right to posse comitatus. Now the government of the United States can use our taxpayer-funded military within the country to put down any resistance. They can come into your house. They've thrown away habeas corpus. They can come into your house at 3 o'clock in the morning, roust you out of your bed, take you in the secrecy of the night, put you in prison for an indeterminate period of time without charge. They don't have to charge you. They don't even have to try you. They can just put you in the pokey permanently. And, of course, they have the option of whether to feed you and water you or not. Do you see the tyranny and oppression coming to the United States? Might we legitimately suspect that the old world order is being restored right before our very eyes? Is it so absurd to assert that the Pope is again ruling the world like he did during the old world order? It's not absurd. It's facts on the ground. Prima facie evidence to support the very real and prophesied condition of the last days before Christ returns. Facts on the ground. These are the last days. Rome is in her heyday. And for whatever reason, legitimate or otherwise, the American people seem completely oblivious to where this is all coming from. And it should be common sense. It should be biblically and historically already established in our minds. Who's at the head of this new world order? The Pope of Rome, the biblical and historical Antichrist. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow on Inquisition Update.